Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week's show is going to focus on how none of the hijackers should have been given visas to enter this country. It's going to focus on how the United States used the consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, the same place many of the hijackers got their visas, to bring, quote, terrorists or, quote, rebels to this country to train for the Afghanistan-Russia war in the 1980s. It's going to focus on how people who should have been held accountable were not, and instead were rewarded and promoted, as has been the case too often with regards to 9/11.
Okay, this is John, and I'm here with Michael Springmann. How are you doing today, Michael?
Oh, pretty good. Finishing the finishing touches on my book, Time for Terror, and earning a little money for the company by doing some work for clients.
Excellent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read your bio. J. Michael Springmann was a civil servant at the Commerce Department's International Trade Administration, as well as a diplomat in the State Department's Foreign Service, with postings to Germany, India, Saudi Arabia, and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in Washington, D.C. The published author of several articles on national security themes, he is now an attorney in private practice in the Washington, D.C. area. In addition to a J.D. from American University in Washington, D.C., he holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in international affairs from Georgetown University and Catholic University, both in the nation's capital. Magazines which have published his articles include Covert Action Quarterly, Unclassified, Global Research, Global Outlook, OpEdNews, The Public Record, and Foreign Policy Journal. In June 2004, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee granted him its Pro Bono Attorney of the Year Award. Oh, congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get right into the questions.
Sure.
And the very first question is, what was the day of 9/11 like for you?
Well, it was a long and sort of stressful day. I had been on my way to an appointment at the Arlington County Courthouse with a potential client. And as I was going down Foxhole Road towards the river and towards the bridge that crosses the Potomac, I could see all the smoke somewhere over Alexandria. And I had no idea what was going on. And finally I got a good look at the smoke. It was a huge cloud of white smoke that pretty much obscured the southern skyline. And I wondered if a plane had crashed. And once I got to the courthouse, the place was surrounded by police. And one of them had told me that the trade towers in New York were gone. My response to him was, well, this is American state-sponsored terrorism, and it's come home to roost like turkeys. Following that, I said, well, I'm obviously not going to get into the courthouse. I tried reaching my client. I couldn't do it with my cell phone. And had to struggle back into the city trying several different ways because of a tremendous amount of traffic that was going in both directions. Tried again when I got to the pharmacy to pick up some medicines and still couldn't get through on the telephone. And the owner of the pharmacy was crying and had the set on, and he was watching the buildings come down again and again and again. So it was a remarkably frustrating and non-productive day.
So you're saying, I'm sorry, go ahead, continue.
But basically, it was, my thought throughout today was the Americans are finally paying for what they've done to other countries.
Wow. So your first thought was what's considered to be blowback.
Yeah.
For the 9/11 attacks. That was not my first thought.
Pardon?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, this was, the Americans had destroyed Iraq in 1993, and this was a couple of years before they destroyed it again in 2003. But in the meantime, the Americans were rampaging through the Balkans, destroying Yugoslavia, and supporting the Israelis in their attacks on Palestine and their neighbors. So I decided this is finally the Americans are getting a bit of their own back.
So you were obviously someone that was paying closer attention to what's going on in the world than I was, because I was.
Well, I try to. I mean, I've got the degrees. I've been overseas with the State Department. I have a number of friends from various countries, and I have maybe a different idea and outlook on things than a lot of other people do.
Well, I'm sure you do. All right. My next question. Can you please describe your role with the U.S. State Department in the late 1980s?
Sure. Prior to my going to Jeddah in 1986 in September, I had tried to get into the Foreign Service a number of times and always turned down for one reason or another. I got into the State Commerce Exchange Program, which provided assignments in Washington to the State Department officers and assignments abroad for people in the International Trade Administration. They would go as Foreign Service Reserve officers and be treated as diplomats. I'd also gone to New Delhi as one of the first people sent abroad into the new Foreign Commercial Service. I was commercial attaché there for a couple of years. But in the late 80s, I was in Jeddah, or on the way to Jeddah, and I was going to go out as the officer in charge of the visa section of the American consulate. Consulates typically have an economic, a political section, a commercial section, and a consular section, and an administrative section. And what happens is that the commercial section was taken away from the state and given to the Commerce Department. But by and large, political and economic officers consort with presidents and kings. People who do consular work tend to be seen as social workers, and the administrative section fixes broken toilets.
Okay.
And in Jeddah, I was running the visa section, and I had heard some strange stories about the place before I got out there. And it was things like the American ambassador was in town for consultations at the department, and I was told by the desk that I could go and have a quick meet and greet session with him. I said, sure. I went in and spent about 5 minutes saying I'm part of your new official family. I'm happy to go to Jeddah, etc. And the next thing I knew, he spent 45 minutes bending my ear on all the problems that the Jeddah consulate was creating for the embassy in Riyadh. The women who were wives of rich Saudis were going to the States with an entourage of hairdressers and seamstresses and things like this. And suddenly they're getting visas, and the visas were getting turned down. And he kept on and on about this, and I couldn't quite figure out what he was telling me. I knew he was telling me something, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. And later on, I heard from the Ellen Goff at the administrative office for the Bureau of Near East South Asia that, yeah, she'd heard about problems in Jeddah with visas, but she didn't know what they were really. Strange, because I'd been told by an experienced consular officer that the first thing that's a sign of trouble in the consular section is that things are not what they seem, and there is some really strange stuff going on. Oh boy. And I got to Jeddah. I was welcomed with open arms, and treated like royalty almost. And they all said that your predecessor had created such problems that, we're glad you're here. I said, well, this woman's going to give me tenure, and she's going to make me look like $1 million. So, after a bit, it wasn't, Mike, would you please take a look at this visa application? We want to make sure this guy gets a visa to go to the States. It was, why did you turn that visa down? We want this guy to go to the States. We want him to get a visa. What's going on? And basically, the law and the regulations state that a visa applicant is a intended immigrant unless and until he can prove otherwise. And the consular officer is to refuse the visa unless he is certain that the guy is going to see that. And he's going to go to America, look at the Grand Canyon, visit his relatives, or sign a contract, and then come back to his country of origin or place of application. And this went on for a year and a half, and got nastier and nastier. And I was repeatedly threatened. I was told that I would be out of the Foreign Service if I didn't do what was wanted. And the driving force behind this, for the most part, was J. Schultz Freres, Freres. He was the Consul General. And I couldn't quite figure out how the Consul General got involved in this, because what I was doing was way below his pay grade. And it got to the point where at one time there was a guy bringing a pile of visa applications over with passports, and he said, you can issue the visas now, or you can do it after I talk to Jay Freres. And I complained to Justice Stevens, just as a given name, who was head of the consular section. I complained to Stephanie Smith in Riyadh, who was the counselor for consular affairs. And she had told me this was a very bad situation. You need to go back to Washington and talk to the Bureau of Consular Affairs the next time you're in D.C.
I'm sorry. Let's back up 1 second. So basically, your role at the consular office was to issue visas for individuals who wanted to go to the United States. And
that's right.
While you were there, you found many applicants should have been turned down. You were turning them down, and people above you were telling you to let the visas go as opposed to being turned down. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. For example, I'll give you Paul Arvid Tait, T-V-E-I-T. He's listed in namebase.org as an official of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was in the commercial section in Jeddah, and I had turned down two guys, I think from Pakistan, who were going to the American Automotive Parts and Accessories trade show in Chicago. And when I asked these people what trade show they were going to, they didn't know. They were just going with a Commerce Department trade mission. And I said, well, where is this being held? And they said, well, it's going to be in Detroit. And that was the wrong city. Every year, the show was held in Chicago. I knew that from working at the Commerce Department and being in their automotive parts and accessories section. And I turned them down. And, within an hour, Spake was on the phone with me arguing about how they had to have visas because the Commerce Department wanted them. And I said, look, if they can't name the trade show and don't know what city it's being held in, I'm not going to give them a visa. And I cited the Section 214B of the Immigration and Nationality Act and the State Department's own regulations. And then called Justice Stevens and got my refusal reversed, and these guys got their visas.
So, who and when did you notify people of what was going on in Jeddah? Like, who did you complain to? In other words,
I complained to Justice Stevens, and he told me to shut up and issue the visas. If Freres wants it, Freres should get it, and don't ask questions. And I complained to Stephanie Smith in Riyadh, who turns out, according to Namebase, also works for the CIA. And it went like this for about a year and a half. I even, in fact, in Washington, on my way to my next assignment in Stuttgart, I talked to the Bureau of Consular Affairs, and they could care less.
Right. So what happened as an end result of all of this?
Well, I eventually got tossed out of the Foreign Service. They refused to give me tenure, like you get tenure at a university, and I was out on the street. And
so,
I complained.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, well, I complained to the Inspector General's office at State. I complained to what was then the Government Accounting Office, and now it's called the Government Accountability Office. I eventually complained to the Inspector General of the State Department, and all I got out of it was I was imagining things. I had a personality conflict with Freres. There was no real issue there.
So you weren't, or were you given whistleblower status protection?
No. I talked to a couple of attorneys. One woman never got back to me. She wouldn't talk to me about my situation. And another firm, Neil, Shaw, Mullen, Holtz, and Seeger, the people who got me into the State Department when they refused to let me in because I had bad feet, they told me, well, you're just going to have to argue to the judge that you know how to manage the State Department better than the State Department does.
Well,
I get no help from anybody.
Did you try suing them or anything to get your job back? Or
well, what I did was I complained after that to the FBI, to the Justice Department, and basically I was ignored. Then I filed Freedom of Information Act request to find out what was going on and figure out why I didn't have a job anymore. And state gave me useless information, things like pay stubs and travel orders and things like this, which I already had. And I got to the point where I said, all right, I'll file a Freedom of Information Act. I'll do it on my own since I can't afford a lawyer. I had basically nothing coming in except DC unemployment insurance, and that wasn't a whole lot of money, and it was taxable besides, thanks to Ronald Reagan. So, got nowhere with the lawsuit. It was eventually sealed as a threat to national security. And to this day, I don't have any idea why. Finding out why I was fired somehow is a threat to the national security.
Well, that's
after that, a year or two later, I was researching an article for Unclassified and had been given Joe Trento's name. He is a journalist that does national security things in the Washington area. He's currently with the public education. Can't think of that at the moment. Was talking to Joe and about what I was researching, and then he was kind of abrupt with me and then asked me who I was and what I was doing. And I mentioned I'd been to Jeddah and had all these problems with visas. And he says, "Well, you know Osama bin Laden?" I said, "Well, no, but I went to a bin Laden wedding, and I don't remember the guy's name, but it wasn't Osama bin Laden getting married that night." So I went over to his office, and he told me that essentially what had happened was the CIA and the State Department were working together, sending junior consular officers out to issue visas in Jeddah. And if they weren't smart enough to ask what was going on, they would get tenure and they would have a career in the Foreign Service. If they asked questions like I did, they weren't with the program and would be booted out. And Joe told me that what they were doing was recruiting people for the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And the guys they were recruiting were being sent to Washington or other parts of the United States for training. And I found out later a lot of this was done in Virginia at one of the CIA facilities, and also at SEAL and other military facilities in North Carolina. And I was amazed at this and talked to a couple of other people, one of whom worked for the Voice of America, and another guy connected with George Washington University, and they told me, yeah, this is pretty much it. These guys were being recruited, and the Saudis weren't letting them back into the kingdom once they had gotten out of Afghanistan and the war with the Soviets was over. They didn't want them home using what they learned in Afghanistan to effect regime change in their own country.
Well, in an Associated Press article from July 2002 entitled, "Did U.S. Train Arabs to Help Afghans Oust Soviets?" End quote. It says the following: "The State Department has no comment on Springmann's allegations except to say final authority over visa decisions rests with the consular officer in charge, not with Springmann, a junior officer." End quote. What is your response to that? That essentially is your argument, isn't it? That the people above you were essentially telling you what to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The issue, well, the article came about because George Gedda had read the Covert Action Quarterly article, and that article got a great play in Canada. I had been interviewed by the Canadian Broadcasting Company in the National Press Building. And this apparently was going viral, and Gedda had me in to meet with him and a woman who he said had been in Saudi Arabia, and we went through the points of what I had just told you. And then he looked at the article, which seemed to die. I don't know many places it was printed, except I saw the one in the the Deseret News, and some fellow from the LaRouche Executive Intelligence Review sent me a copy from some place in the Middle East. But by and large, the way things go with visas and visa referrals and visa refusals and so forth is that if a consular officer, and I was in charge of the visa section, refuses a visa, the only way a refusal can be overridden was by a senior Foreign Service officer with the consular commission. Plus having more information that was not available to the denying officer when he actually did the interview. And you have to write a written report. This is written up in Volume 9, Foreign Affairs Manual, Section 41.121. So I would refuse, and then Freres and company would say, reverse your refusal or else. And I finally got to the point where I would write notations on the visa form saying, this was refused per order of J.P. Freres. I issue the visa.
Right. Okay. Well, with regards to the CIA sending recruits through Jeddah to the United States to train, there is information that supports that, and apparently in 1980. And this information is from historycommons.org. It says, some fighters opposing the Soviets in Afghanistan begin training in the U.S. According to journalist John Cooley, who is an ABC correspondent, the training is done by Navy SEALs and Green Beret officers who have taken draconian secrecy oaths. Key Pakistani officers are trained, as well as some senior Afghan mujahideen. Much of the training takes place in Camp Peary near Williamsburg, Virginia, which is said to be the CIA's main location for training spies and assets. Other training takes place at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Harvey Point, North Carolina, and Fort A.P. Hill, Virginia. Subjects are trained in how to detect explosives, surveillance, how to recruit new agents, how to run paramilitary operations, and more. They are taught to use many different weapons as well, including remote-controlled mines and bombs, and sophisticated timers and explosives. Now, this is not the first time that the United States has brought, whatever you want to call them, rebels, terrorists, to the United States to train. In 2012, Seymour Hersh from the New Yorker reported that the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, the JSOC, trained operatives from the Mujahideen al-Khalq, or MEK, at a secret site in Nevada beginning in 2005. Now, according to Hersh, MEK members were trained in intercepting communications, cryptography, weaponry, and small tactics at the Nevada site, and they were supposed to be used in Iran, I believe. Now, it's interesting about that story is the MEK was considered to be a terrorist organization, and there was a campaign.
A number of these people, the organizations the Americans have condemned publicly, they work with privately and under the covers.
Exactly, and the MEK is considered to be, or was considered to be, a terrorist organization, and they were on the State Department's terrorism list, and there was a big campaign to get them off of that list, and a lot of the people who took part in that were people like Rudy Giuliani, who, was supposedly America's mayor from 9/11, and arguing on behalf of a terrorist group, and eventually, Hillary Clinton made sure that they were taken off of the State Department's terrorism list. So Joe Trento told you essentially why you were being made to allow visas that you didn't think should go through, correct? It was Joe?
Yeah.
Okay, just so people know, Joe Trento, as he said, is a journalist in D.C. Paul Thompson, who is the creator of the complete 9/11 timeline, swears by Joe Trento. Joe Trento was mentioned in the book 11th Day, and Michael Springmann is also mentioned in the book 11th Day. I forget the authors. I think it was Anthony Swan or somebody like that. Some people question what Joe has to say, but he's broken a lot of stories over the years. So just wanted to.
No, I've been told that people that don't like Joe Trento say that whatever you say about him, he has excellent sources and good context.
Right. Now,
he's given me some ink in his book Prelude to Terror.
He gave you some ink in his book Prelude to Terror?
Yeah, it was a couple of pages talking about my situation in Jeddah.
Right. Okay. Now, you were talking about, or you mentioned the State Department and the CIA working hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And I've heard such things before, from 9/11 whistleblowers to Bell Edmonds, and it seems to make sense to me that the CIA would be working with the State Department. A position in an embassy in another country just makes sense for a spy, if you understand what I'm saying. So,
they love it because they have diplomatic immunity. They pretend to be consular officers, administrative officers, or political officers, and they've got the diplomatic passport. So the worst the host country do is declare them persona non grata and send them home. Tossed into a secret prison.
I found an article from Tech Dirt from July 2014 about some of the torture that the CIA was doing, and it says, quote, "Officials at the State Department were well aware of the ongoing CIA torture efforts, but were instructed not to tell their superiors, such that it's likely that the top officials, including Secretary of State Colin Powell, may have been kept in the dark, while others at the State Department knew of the highly questionable CIA actions," end quote. So that's an example of them working together. But now,
for example, we had out of some 20 Americans, there were only 3 people: myself, Mike Springmann, Lonnie Washington, the only State Department communicator, and Jim Page, an administrative officer. We were the only people I knew for a certainty to have no ties, professional or familial, with any of the American intelligence service. Conceivably, there may be a couple more that I was wrong about, but by and large, it was basically a CIA operation. I've talked to a former station chief who asked not to be named, and this individual, along with a real Foreign Service officer, Jay Hawley, who's now retired, both told me that the average for people who don't work for the State Department but say they do is about 1 in 3 at a Foreign Service post. In Jeddah, it was obviously more. There was a retired American ambassador who figured it was about half. And if you look at this book that was produced in Canada, which I've never got my hands on, it's called The 80 CIA Covert Diplomats, Spooks in the Foreign Service. It's a 1983 Canadian publication that says the average people who work for the intelligence services at a Foreign Service post is 60%.
Wow. Well, that's certainly interesting. And I want to make sure people understand why we're talking about Jeddah, why it was so important to have you on the show today. 12 of the 19 hijackers got their visas from the U.S. Consulate's office in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Now, my next question, we have learned that the United States did not end its relationship with groups like the Mujahideen after the Afghanistan-Russia war, and instead continued to work with them throughout the 90s. Is it a reasonable assumption to make that since that relationship with the Mujahideen never ended, the situation at the consulate in Jeddah never ended either?
I would think so. I haven't been back for a while, but from what I had originally thought, my complaints, my Freedom of Information Act requests, my Freedom of Information Act lawsuits might have forced them to damp things down, but from what I've seen so far with what was done in Iraq, what was done in the Balkans, in Libya, and in Syria, obviously they've been recruiting and keeping the what I call the Arab Afghans going. This is what they were called in Afghanistan because they weren't Afghan, but they were Arabs and other nationalities and ethnicities fighting on the same side as the Afghans.
Well, my question was essentially, do you think that situation was still going on at the time
of
9/11?
Oh yeah. I mean, even during the war in Afghanistan, when the Soviets withdrew in when was it, 1990, 1991, the Americans kept recruiting and kept bringing these people in to fight. It went on for another 3 years till about 1995.
Okay. Now, many of the hijackers, in fact, some people say all of the hijackers, for a number of reasons, should not have been given visas. Are you aware of some of the reasons why?
Well, I've seen some things online of what could be photocopies of the visa applications. And they basically look like a lot of visa applications I saw in Jeddah and what I heard about in Germany from the people I knew in the consular sections. People just don't fill out the application, or they do it sloppily, they leave blanks, or they put vague information in the blanks that they're required to fill in. So one of the things I would do when I was in the visa window, at the time we required visas for everybody except we required personal appearances for everybody except Saudis, and if I had a question, I would bring the Saudi in for an interview. But by and large, I would go to the application form, and I would say, well, you've got a blank here. Where are you going to stay in the United States? Do you have a hotel? Are you going to visit relatives? You've left out a time of arrival. Which month is it, for example? Do you have any kind of specific day? Do you have a month? Give me some more information. And by and large, in the space of about 2 minutes, they would talk themselves out of a visa because they couldn't answer or wouldn't answer a lot of my questions.
Right. I have some information about why they should not have been given visas. So this is all from, this part is from History Commons. Between April 3rd and 7th, 2001, 3 hijackers are given visas to the United States through the U.S. consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. They are Nawaf al-Hamzi, Salam al-Hazmi, and Khalid al-Midar. It says, quote, Al-Midar and Nawaf al-Hazmi are already, quote, Al-Qaeda veterans, end quote, and battle-hardened killers, end quote. Quote, all 3 men have indicators in their passports marking them as Islamic radicals. These indicators are used to track them by the Saudi authorities, but apparently are not noticed by U.S. officials. So these are individuals that actually had a stamp that said they were terrorists, and they still managed to get visas. And from another report, this is from ABC News, quote, the political journal National Review obtained the visa applications for 15 of the 19 hijackers, and evidence that all of them should have been denied entry to the country. Almost all of the hijackers' visas were issued in Saudi Arabia at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh or the U.S. Consulate in Jeddah. Terrorist ties aside, the applications themselves should have raised red flags, say experts. The forms are incomplete and often incomprehensible, yet that didn't stop any of the 15 terrorists from whom the visa applications were obtained from coming to the United States, end quote. And then it goes on to say, quote, they were handing these things out gift-wrapped with ribbons on a top, said Joel Mowbray, contributing editor of the National Review. Mowbray, who obtained the visas, said he was shocked by what he saw. Quote, I mean, really, I was expecting Al-Qaeda to have trained their operatives well to beat the system, end quote, he said. Quote, they didn't have to beat the system. the system was rigged in their favor from the get-go, end quote. Now, in response to these revelations, the State Department says, quote, the fact is that with 2020 hindsight, I'm sure one can always find a reason that you might have turned down a visa, end quote. Now, the General Accounting Office in October 21st, 2002, the General Accounting Office, the nonpartisan investigative arm of Congress, releases a report asserting that at least 13 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were never interviewed by U.S. consular officials before being granted visas to enter the U.S. This contradicts previous assurances from the State Department that 12 of the hijackers had been interviewed. Now, in December 2002, Senators John Kyle and Pat Roberts stated in a chapter of the 9/11 congressional inquiry that, quote, if State Department personnel had merely followed the law and not granted non-immigrant visas to 15 of the 19 hijackers in Saudi Arabia, 9/11 would not have happened, end quote. So that's, some of what they said about the visas of these hijackers. Now, 12 of the hijackers, as I said, were issued visas at the consulate in Jeddah, where you worked, and they were issued by a woman named Shana Steinger. Are you familiar with her?
To an extent, yeah, I had looked her up after we had talked a couple of days ago and found out that her background is a little bit odd. She was commissioned as FSO 4 in 1999, and at the time her name was Shana Steinger Singh, S-I-N-G-H. And I thought this was really odd because generally someone is brought in as a junior officer on their first tour is like an FSO 6 or an FSO 7. In my case, I was a 5 because I had a master's degree and had worked for a number of years for the government. In her case, she came directly out of Columbia University to the State Department, and I've not been able to find out whether she had a doctor's degree that might have gotten her in as a 4, but it seems an awfully high rank for somebody to sit on the visa line for their first tour.
Well, just so people know, Shana Steinger is the woman who issued the 12 visas to the 9/11 hijackers at the consulate in Jeddah. She gave, quote, incorrect testimony, end quote, to the House Committee on Government Reform, and also makes, quote, incorrect statements, end quote, to the 9/11 Commission. She is not mentioned in the 9/11 report at all. And after 9/11, she was continuously promoted throughout the State Department. And, before 9/11, this is what she said. Quote, she was never aware of the level of disaffected extremism in Saudi society, she says. Now, apparently, before she got there, they were a lot more strict in issuing visas, but she apparently issued visas to a lot of people. And her opposite, the guy who worked with her, who I don't remember his name, was the exact opposite. He turned down a lot of people. So it's just amazing to me that the woman who issued 12 of the visas literally is not even mentioned in the 9/11 report.
Well, pretty much indicates she's one of the agency staff there. My predecessor, who supposedly made all the problems for the ambassador in Riyadh, is now ambassador to Oman, Greta Holtz.
Wow.
And she would do things like call the Internal Revenue Service about people she suspected of living abroad and not paying American taxes.
Interesting.
So the women I've met in the State Department are generally more of a hard case than the men. That they do things literally. They have no imagination, and they're troublemakers. And from what I could see, both Greta and this Shana Steinger Singh were not exactly your typical consular officer.
Well, it certainly, she was never held accountable. That's something that we saw a lot of after 9/11 is that people in government who should have been held accountable were not, and in many cases, as in her case, they were instead rewarded and promoted.
Yeah, exactly.
Now,
the thing. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that as far as the people that got the visas, that had the clear traces of being terrorists or whatever, every visa application at the time was sent to Washington to run through their automated lookout system to see if they're axe murderers, terrorists, or what have you. And obviously, this was not done, or if it was done, they had monkeyed with the data in Washington, or maybe the CIA never put these people into the database. I don't know. That's a possibility, since they don't seem to talk to one another sometimes.
3 of the hijackers obtained their visas through the Visa Express program. Now, are you familiar with it? I have a definition of what the Visa Express program. I'll just read it real fast.
Sure.
This is from Wiki. Quote, the U.S. introduced the Visa Express program in May 2001. This program allowed Saudi Arabian residents, including non-citizens, to get valid visas through a travel agency using a much less restrictive standard than would have otherwise been required. They did not have to submit a proof of identity, but only had to provide a photograph and fill out a short form. A senior State Department official described the program as a, quote, an open-door policy for terrorists, end quote. No other country had this system to facilitate easy entry into the country. So are you familiar with the Visa Express program? What's your opinion about it?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just think it's very interesting that, months before 9/11, they decided to implement this program that only applies to Saudi Arabia and makes it easier, as they said, for terrorists to get into the country.
Yeah. Well, when I was there, the Saudis were seen as good visa prospects, and they didn't have to appear personally for a visa interview. They would simply send a passport over with photographs and a visa application form filled out. And the Visa Express system sounds very much like what I was told by Celerino Castillo, the Drug Enforcement Agency officer who operated in Latin America. He once told me by phone that typically what the CIA would do in South America would be to send the guys they wanted to get visas to come to the States for training or debriefings or whatever to a legitimate travel agent, and they would be bundled up with a bunch of other applicants for visas who are simple, ordinary travelers. They would be shipped over to the American Foreign Service Post, and because they came from the legitimate travel agency, in a bundle, they wouldn't get the scrutiny that maybe an individual would get if you had kind of a sketchy background on paper. So yeah, I think that's a good way of getting people through if you want.
Well, the 9/11 report says, and this is how it addresses the Visa Express program. It says, quote, in June, the State Department initiated the Visa Express program in Saudi Arabia as a security measure in order to keep long lines of foreigners away from vulnerable embassy spaces. The program permitted visa applications to be made through travel agencies instead of directly at the embassy or consulate. Now, that's all it says. It doesn't say anything about how this program was a bad thing. Now, one thing I want to bring up is an individual by the name of Mary Ryan.
She'd been
Mary Ryan,
Secretary for Consular Affairs, right?
She was the head of the State Department's Consular Service, correct? And that was she was the one essentially responsible for letting most of the hijackers into the U.S. Oh, I'm sorry. It says Mary Ryan, the head of the State Department's Consular Service, that was responsible for letting most of the hijackers into the U.S., is forced to retire. Now, we've said before, oftentimes, that nobody was ever held accountable. This is actually one case where somebody was held accountable. She was forced to retire. However, and the reason was it has been pointed out that Ryan deceived Congress by testifying that, quote, there was nothing state could have done to prevent the terrorists from obtaining visas, end quote. However, after she makes this false statement and she's asked to retire, after all this, Ryan and the other authors of the Visa Express program are given the, quote, outstanding performance, end quote, awards of $15,000 each. The reporter who wrote most of the stories critical of the Visa Express program is briefly detained and pressured by the State Department. So that's very, very interesting.
That's really amazing.
Yeah, it's very amazing. Are you familiar with the story of Abdullah Noman?
Yeah, he had been a Foreign Service national, a local hire, working in the commercial section across the street from the consulate. And he apparently was selling visas and was caught in an FBI sting operation in Nevada.
Right. Well, what History Commons says, this is somebody who worked at the Jeddah office, I thought. Correct?
Well, he wasn't in the consular section. He was in the commercial section.
Okay. It says that he took money and gifts to provide fraudulent visas to foreigners. He pleads guilty and is convicted. This is in May 21st, 2002. About 50 to 100 visas were improperly issued by Noman from September 1996 until November 2001 when he was arrested. So there's all kinds of problems with the consular office in Jeddah.
Yeah, well, when I was there, I had a guy, Mr. Mark, tell me that the price for a visa at the consulate was $2,500. And I called the regional security officer about this and said I had been told that I should look at who needs the money, and the only person I know who needs the money is Jay Ferris, whose house burned down while he was away from the consulate for a couple of months on home leave. So, and nothing ever came of it.
Right. Now, did you ever try to contact any of the investigations into 9/11 so you could speak with them, or did any of them ever try to contact you?
Well, none of them tried to contact me, and I wondered whether it was worthwhile doing it because I eventually decided I wouldn't waste my breath. At Joe Trender's suggestion, I called the FBI after September 11, 2001, and wanted to talk to them about the issues in Jeddah and the Visas for Terrorists program, and was passed from office to office in their main office on Pennsylvania Avenue, and then they transferred me to the Washington field office. And when I got put through there, they said, well, somebody will call you back. Well, it's been, 13 years now, and I'm still waiting for them to call me back.
Wow, that's a shame. See, somebody like you should have been brought in to testify before the 9/11 Commission. Now, my last question to you, and before I ask this question, I just want to thank you for your time today. It's an extremely interesting story. It brings about many questions that need to be answered with regards to how these hijackers managed to get these visas, and why no one was held accountable, and all kinds of things. So I just want to thank you very much for your time today.
No, you're quite welcome. I enjoyed the opportunity to talk out to you once more on this.
Yep. You're currently working on a book. What is the premise of the book, and when will it be available?
Well, I'm in my final draft of what I've titled Time for Terror, the Arab Afghans. And it basically covers a lot of what we talked about tonight. My issues with visas in Jeddah and what I found out later on. And then I move on to the fact that, in my opinion, and based on my research and talking to people with a couple of interviews, that this this group was never disbanded. It was turned into a cadre, maybe not terribly well organized, to destabilize governments the American government didn't like. Like Yugoslavia, that was destroyed. These people, you had Osama bin Laden there, you had veterans of the Afghan War there. They worked with the American government, they worked with NATO to bomb and shoot and kill. And then they were sent to Iraq after the American invasion in 2003, and they were moved up into death squads with Henry Ensher, the alleged political officer from Jeddah, as deputy to the Counselor for Political Affairs, Robert Ford, to recruit these people. Then the same crowd was sent to Libya with the NATO bombing campaign to destroy the country. And then their weapons and the men were shipped into Syria, where they've been hard at work since the last couple of years. And from what I've seen in the papers, they're back in Iraq again, only they've been rebranded as ISIS or ISIL or IS, depending on which day of the week you're talking about.
Well,
so
the point is...
tries to tie all this together.
Right. Okay. Now, the point of this is, and I don't know that it's all the same group that they use. I'm sure, there are different groups that they use, but, governments, our government especially, loves to use, terrorists or rebels or freedom fighters, whatever you want to call them, as a proxy to destabilize governments and so forth. And we saw that throughout the 90s. We were told that program ended, but it did not, as you were mentioning in the Balkans and Yugoslavia. And, Dr. Nafiz Ahmed, who I've already interviewed, who has written a lot on the subject. And,
after he mentioned me in a couple of his books.
He mentioned you in a couple of his books? That's good. And after 9/11, we used, Jundullah in Iran. We used groups, as you mentioned, in Libya with the NATO bombing campaign. Prince Bandar from Saudi Arabia had an operation to send rebels into Syria in an effort to take out Assad. And that was helped by, I believe it was Kuwait and Qatar. And it had to be done, with the U.S. consent. And, the U.S. has been operating in Syria covertly for years. And they've been wanting to take out Assad for years. So to think that they were doing this without U.S. consent would be probably foolish to think. And then eventually the U.S. started sending them intelligence. Then they started sending them arms. And then the U.S. started training rebels in Jordan in order to send into Syria. And then, what happened was all of these rebels in Syria, they worked there, they started to go into Iraq, and they actually, they took advantage of the individuals in Iraq who were angry, at least this is my opinion, who were angry about a decade's worth of sanctions that killed 1 million people, that were angry about our occupation, that killed upwards of 1.25 million, that wounded and displaced millions more.
They're well informed.
Well, they destroyed the infrastructure. The Blackwater was hunting Iraqis for sport. They were torturing people in Abu Ghraib, and a lot of people in Iraq. These kinds of things. There's no statute of limitations on the anger that these kinds of things create. So essentially, all of the rebels that we sent into Syria mix their way into the people in Iraq, and now we have this situation called ISIS, which is essentially a problem of our making, ours and our allies' making.
Exactly.
So that's what your book's about?
Pretty much. It goes back also to the beginnings of all of this in the 40s and the 50s, where Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran was the first victim of the first CIA coup, and Jacobo Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala was the second victim of the second CIA coup. And I mentioned U.S. involvement in Syria and Egypt in the past, in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And their efforts came to naught, I think, in large part because they weren't really organized. Now that they've got this Arab-Afghan Legion, as I call it, in the book, they've got something they can work with. They've been well put together. They've been trained. They know how to handle things. And they've got more uproar, more destruction, and more devastation, and totally collapsed societies and governments all through the region. Just look at what's been done to Libya, and to Syria, and to Iraq. I mean, they're desperate to split Iraq into three pieces, with the Kurdish north, the Sunni center, and then the Shia south. And so far, they haven't been able to do it, despite 11 years of war. Whether they can now with the attacks on the country again, I don't know. That's up in the air.
Well, the whole situation is extremely effed up. I try not to curse on this show, but it's all our doing. If anybody thinks that bombing a region for 13 years would not create enemies, is really foolish to think that. So it essentially creates a perpetual war, which, the military-industrial complex loves, and so forth.
Yeah, and they need us. We need to have the wars because we can restore order with our war, and if we leave, things will get much worse. And I just throw up my hands, and when I hear that's not possible.
I just, I want to bring all the troops home from everywhere. Cut our military budget by 90% and make them only for defensive purposes. If somebody wants to invade our country, that's what our military is for, to defend against something like that. They shouldn't be used to make rich people richer, essentially.
No.
What is the name of your book?
Times of Terror, the Arab-Afghans.
Okay, and when will it be released?
I hope to have it out by the end of the year. I've got my final draft. I've got people working at it, and I'll send it off for a final edit, and then we'll get it marching. I hope to have it out before the elections, but I think it's going to be the end of the year before it's actually printed.
Well, good luck with the release of the book, and again, thank you for your time today.
Well, I enjoyed the opportunity to speak, and it's an honor to be on your show.
Well, thanks a lot, Michael, and I hope to speak with you again.
Inshallah.
All right, have a good one.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.